Hello, everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And the webinar today will be discussing the results of the European elections and the dramatic consequences in France, which appear to have become perhaps even more dramatic in the past 15 minutes. Before doing so, I'd just like to flag on Thursday at the same time, we have a book talk by Ian Proud, former British diplomat, about his book, A Misfit in Moscow, and the breakdown of relations between Russia and the United Kingdom, but as part, of course, of this wider breakdown of relations over the past generation. Before I forget, questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and then I will pass on as many as we have time for to the participants. We will talk for about half an hour, and then I'll throw it open to questions. So it's a great pleasure today to introduce our panel. Our panelists are Molly O'Neill, who is a non-resident fellow of the Quincy Institute, a former US Foreign Service officer, who from 1989, which is when I moved to Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, was devoted to US relations with Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, and Eurasia. And Molly has conducted research, lectured, and written extensively on these areas. Wolfgang Streeck is the Emeritus Director at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne, Germany, and a member of the British Academy, of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, and of the Academia Europaea. And Wolfgang writes extensively for the New Left Review, among many other publications. Matthias Matthijs holds the Dean Acheson Chair at SAIS here in Washington. He's Associate Professor of International Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University, and he is a Senior Fellow in Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. To this extremely topical subject. I thought, since it is very much the issue du jour, if I begin by asking you, Matthias, to say something about President Macron's shock decision to hold elections, parliamentary elections in France, but also a suggestion that I understand he has made about what he might do. Why this decision, and where do you see things going in France?
Yes, thank you, Anatol, first of all, to Quincy Institute for hosting this event and for having me along, such two great co-panelists, Wolfgang Streeck and Molly O'Neill. So again, I'm in Brussels right now. I landed from DC on Sunday morning, and I was hoping, mostly following the Belgian elections, actually, and, which were quite interesting in their own right. And, this looked like a somewhat fairly predictable European elections because it was, the broad aggregate polls had it about right? I mean, European elections seem to be going where the Greens and the Liberals were each losing 20 seats, and then those 40 seats were redistributed amongst the center right and the far right. So from a kind of EU point of view, this seemed a rather, almost say boring, you can talk more about it, election. But then came this kind of rather astonishing announcement by Emmanuel Macron very shortly after Jordan Bardella, the leader of the European elections for Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's far-right party, who had called on the French president to respect the French vote and call, disband parliament, the Assemblée Nationale, and call for an early election. Just for context, right? Rassemblement National had something over 33% of the vote. Macron, with his, kind of party and other alliance, if you want, for Europe, ended up very low at like 15%. So Macron, I think, astonished everybody by very shortly after saying, okay, I'm disbanding parliament and we'll have new elections on June 30 and July 7. So his rationale, I think, was, I'm going to call their bluff. European election turnout is low at 50%. For France, that's low. It's a second-order election for many French, where they enjoy giving the incumbents a good kick in the butt. And when we have a national election where much more is at stake, turnout maybe 80%, there'll be some sort of Republican majority, anti-far right that will come together. And actually, I may end up winning with a workable government that I can do business with for the next 3 years and achieve many of my goals, both in Europe and in France, right? There was also this idea that even if somehow the far right wins, Le Pen does very well. She wants to have Jordan Bardella as prime minister because she would never do this herself and be having to serve under Macron because she'd want to keep away from that. Then if there's chaos, they will own it. And then in 3 years, if Le Pen runs for a 4th time for the presidency, she will not be the anti-establishment candidate because they will have been in power, right? So this is the kind of stuff that EU circles and very clever EU studies people talk to each other about. It's like, oh my God, that's so clever. And my reaction was like, wait, what? That is rule number 1 in politics. You keep your opponents out of power. He is offering it to them. He is taking a major risk here. And so what has happened in just the last 24 hours is the man who fought from the center in 2017 to destroy left and right, to make them irrelevant, has given new energy on the right, where there's talk of a kind of party family where Le Pen will be joined by Zemmour on the far right, as well as even Les Républicains. The president of Les Républicains, Ciotti, announced it, even though that's going to be internally contested. At the same time, the 4 lefty parties have been talking about having a united left front. And so you now see that Macron and the center is being outflanked by a united left, potentially, a united right, potentially, and he can end up with very little. That said, it's a very fluid situation. He, I think, is starting to wake up to the fact that he made a very rash, very quick decision, probably should have slept on it, and now is starting to say things like, well, maybe I might resign if that does happen, and the presidency isn't that sacred either. And so it's hard to comment at a moment sitting here in Brussels, where these things seem to be changing every hour. But that's where we are right now.
I mean, Wolfgang, how big a shift is this in Europe, do you think? And how important and how radical are deeper shifts in European economic, society, political culture that underlie these changes? Wolfgang?
Wolfgang, you're on mute.
I think you're muted.
But now?
That's fine.
Now? Oh, okay. Okay, good. No, I mean, it is important to distinguish between the national effects of these elections and the European Union as a whole. And then a third thing is sort of the general social and political condition behind the two. And if I want to say something on the sort of commonalities of European countries, on which then national events sort of build up and grow, then we have seen in the last 20 years sort of permanent decline of the confidence, of the trust of citizens in their political parties and governments and institutions. And that was not from nothing. Now we have what people now call a polycrisis. Something that is also experienced in the United States, incidentally, but looking at Europe, here it is. We have financial instability after the 2008 crisis. We have no real solution to this. We have stagnant growth, seriously rising public debt, the experience of the immigration crisis and the COVID crisis that have not been managed very well by almost any country on the European continent, stagnant wages, the increasing precarity of employment. All of these things come together, and people, when they vote, they don't look back. We've had it so good. They look into the future. Well, who can offer us some kind of sense that things will get better rather than getting worse? That we don't have to work harder in order to stay in place. And these are sort of very deep sentiments. And then the Yellow Vests in France expressed this sentiment. In Germany, the fact that what used to be the left, in a sense, the Greens having mopped up what was left of the left, so to speak, have become part of the governing establishment, and things haven't become better. In fact, they have become more sort of uncertainty creating, yes, and to put all this together, then it is not surprising that at least in some countries you will see a reshuffling in the party systems that play themselves out in different ways. In Germany, for example, the Greens decline, the AfD increases to a level of, let's say, 15%. The Greens fall down to a level of 15. I thought in the last year, I had this idea that what we saw in Germany in particular was a sort of culture war between two 15% parties. One is the AfD, one is the Greens, and in between the others have to find a place, so to speak, or something new arises, like this very interesting party, the Bündnis Sarah Bank, BSW, which comes out like nothing. Then I did one more point on sort of, there are generalities in this general sense of uncertainty, but there are also peculiarities. And if you look at Germany, then you have this fascinating picture that the East German former GDR states are now sort of all with a relative majority of the AfD. All of these 5 states, now the old, and in West Germany, this is a little bit different, but I think if you take up this theme of the sort of confidence in the future, then one has to remember that East Germany is a country that has undergone a convulsive change in the 1990s, sort of dramatic change from the bottom of social life to the top. Whereas Germany sort of went like nicely, like we had our West Germany, we had our sort of social revolution in the 1950s and late 1940s. And my generation grew up with a sense of whatever happens, we'll sort of get along. This is not the case in East Germany. If you tell them now, folks, we all have to go through a major transformation in everything, eat no meat anymore, do this sort of thing, then they remember the 1990s. They have just gone through it, yeah, and who in the party establishment, including the Greens, is willing to offer them some sort of hope that they will be protected from the worst things that can happen in such a transition. Nobody can, and I'll say something more on the new members of the German party system. Final point on this. In Germany, the idea was in the last two years or so that you form a huge sort of bloc or the popular front of all democratic forces against the AfD, and they sort of let loose the domestic intelligence service, the courts, the police, and the press, and everybody was sort of beating on the AfD. The new Nazis. They never marched in the streets in brown uniform. There was no industry that financed them. There was no Eastern nobility that sort of brought them to power. The Eastern nobility doesn't exist anymore because the Russians finished them off after 1945. Yeah, nothing like this. But everybody says these are the new Nazis. What happens? They get 15%. What happens among the young people? They even get 17%, because people perceive that this bunch of parties that tell us but basically the same thing. We don't want to give our confidence to them. Who is there as an alternative for for Germany? And then we vote for them.
Yeah. Molly, how do you see this affecting the European Union as such and European politics, including European foreign and security policy as presented up to now by von der Leyen?
Right. Yes, thanks. I think it might be useful just to sketch in a little bit of what did change as a result of these elections. And I think that the emphasis given in a lot of the press coverage and analytical community to the rise of the far right isn't fallacious. I think it actually is a real thing. So I would first lay out the fact that there are three different categories of far right, shall we call them, in the groupings in the parliament. The European conservatives and reformists. This one includes Meloni's party, and Meloni is a highly influential figure in I think in this new shifting set of coalitions. She heads, of course, the Brothers of Italy party. I'm very familiar too with politics in Poland, and the other one you're all familiar with too, I'm sure. That's an important party in this grouping is the Law and Justice Party, headed by Kaczynski and the former Prime Minister Morawiecki. So, and then far to their right is this Identity and Democracy grouping. This includes Le Pen's party, Rassemblement National, the Freedom Party of Austria, which came first in the elections in their country, Geert Wilders' Freedom Party in the Netherlands, and the Lega, which is another to the right of, this party is in the government headed by Meloni. So what happened in the days just prior to the election is AfD was expelled from that grouping, so that some of the gains of the far right that are somewhat obscured by the fact that AfD shows up in the unaffiliated category. They won 15 seats. It's substantial. And then also in the unaffiliated category is Fidesz, the Hungarian governing party. They won 10 seats. They came first, of course, in Hungary, although they were more contested than they had been previously. So there is a substantial set of votes or seats that are for the far right, as broadly understood, that are in the unaffiliated category currently. So it is true that overall, the governing coalition, which is the centrist coalition, which has supported von der Leyen and is really essential to the working of the European Parliament, it did stand up pretty well, with the exception, of course, of the Liberals, who lost quite substantially. So the governing coalition, potential governing coalition, is about 400 seats. And you only need 361 to govern. So it should put von der Leyen in a position to be reelected, although it's worth noting that this is a secret vote and there's no real whipping the way there is in a lot of national parliaments. So we cannot be certain how much dissatisfaction may be still looming there, even if I think she will be designated by the council, in other words, the summit of leaders, I think that's happening next week. So the Greens were also a huge loser, and I do think that's an important development. So what's happening now is that because von der Leyen isn't certain that she can get the votes, she's actually been flirting a bit with Meloni in terms of trying to get votes from Brothers of Italy. The trouble with that strategy is that these socialist members, the socialists and Democrats, will not vote for her if she does that. So there may be some interesting intrigue yet to come from this on the surface, rather boring outcome. So one of the things that could happen is a formation of a bloc to encompass both the Meloni ECR group and the Identity and Democracy group. if that could be accomplished, this delegation would be the second largest after the European People's Party. So why is all this important to actual policy? Well, I think you have to inquire into what, and to what to some extent, Wolfgang has already done this masterfully, as always, is that what is really driving the success of these parties? Because after all, the far right, in this broad definition, came first in the elections in France, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia, if you count the ruling party as being, it's really left populist, but it has much in common with this group. And strong second position in Germany, very, very critical. In fact, for the AfD to come second after the Christian Democrats and surpass the result of all three of the parties in coalition, I think that's kind of almost seismic. I think it's very, very important. And it's also interesting that the recent protests against AfD resulting from different scandals related to their potentially receiving money from Russia or from China and other scandals of that nature, that took them down from about 22% about 6 months ago. So it has affected their standing, but it wasn't enough to prevent the result that we've seen. So I think that's also very telling. So what's interesting also is to look at the possibility that certain, including Meloni, there's also Le Pen herself, Morawiecki, the former Polish prime minister, and Orban have all suggested that forming a right grouping encompassing all these parties would be a desirable thing, an aim that they might seek. The difficulty is that the reasons that these parties succeeded relatively have been discussed, and it should be a result of a lot of different factors. Migrant arrivals, of course, has been a primary concern all of them have. Weak economy, of course, is something that they're building upon grievances about the performance of the economy, and opposition to the green transition, and also just nationalism, anti-EU politics, which is a theme in domestic politics in all these countries, is the refusal or the rejection of excessive power exercised by the European Commission. But then finally, I think the one that gets at the heart of the foreign and security policy question is the extent to which these parties, and only some of them, not all of them, do not or question the support for the war for the Ukrainian fight against Russia. So to the extent that any sort of new energy is imparted to these right-wing forces within the parliament, we might see some impact on foreign and security policy.
Well, I'd like to pick up on that because we have several questions from the floor precisely about that, whether this is likely either in the short term or in the longer term to lead to serious change in European policies towards the war in Ukraine and relations with Russia. Matthias, what do you think on that score?
I think this outcome is neutral. The main question over Ukraine's future, I think, is in the White House in the United States in November rather than in Europe, right? I mean, in the end, we can, if you get rid of all the noise of this election and you look at the path ahead over the next 6 months, I think the EU heads of state or government will give it to von der Leyen for a second term. It will be up to her, as I think Molly rightly pointed out, to cobble together a majority in the European Parliament. And it will be just as difficult as last time, if not more, right? Because the fluidity of these party families. I think they'll also try to get the other top jobs in place before Orban on July 1 takes over with Hungary, the rotating presidency of the European Union. But at the end of the day, I mean, look at how Meloni, her old sympathies for Putin a few years ago, has put them aside. I mean, it seems like when people come to power, even Marine Le Pen herself, right, speaks a very different tune, applauded Zelensky and all that when he showed up in the D-Day actually did a better job, Marine Le Pen, than Rishi Sunak did electorally there. On the Normandy beaches, kind of taking the side of Zelensky in this war. I mean, Marine Le Pen is on a path she wants to become president of France, right? I don't think she cares too much about the European Parliament. If Meloni wants to form a super grouping, great. But her point, kicking out the AFD from the ID grouping in the European Parliament, was to become president of France, was to show I am not as radical as those guys, right? So in many ways, I see a kind of, it's not as strong a consensus on supporting Ukraine as it might have been 2 years ago or even 1 year ago. But it's there, right? I mean, this would be a clear taboo that any government leader would break, apart from Orban, of course, where we know where he stands, but he seems to go along with most of EU support for Ukraine most of the time anyway, right? So, I mean, I think the main question mark is the US support and not in the EU. I think this doesn't move the needle much, even though you could interpret it as maybe not great news, this shift to the right. But yeah, as we've seen from Meloni, it's not clear that the far right sticks to that sort of principle either.
So I suppose if the war in Ukraine drags on and on with further Russian successes and no prospect for, in fact, a Ukrainian victory, then people might perhaps start reverting to their former positions in future, but not exactly, I mean, not today. Wolfgang, what do you think on that score?
Yeah, I think that in many ways, the pivotal country here is Germany. Germany is sort of the economically strongest country, better able than all others to stand a long-drawn sort of war and position in Ukraine. On the other hand, it's also very exposed, closer to the event than France. It has 38,000 American troops on its soil. An unknown number of American nuclear warheads, which the Germans have no control of. They are not a nuclear power. If something gets really serious in Ukraine, Germany will be very, very hard hit, and more than others. Than other outsiders. So yes, there is a possibility that at some stage this sort of unwavering support for Ukraine, which one has to say it wasn't so unwavering at the beginning, and Frau von der Leyen played an important role in this. She sort of herded the entire European community behind the demand that the Germans do more for Ukraine. She called all these wonderful conferences, to travel to Kiev, I don't know, once a week to sort of reassure the Ukrainian government, which not necessarily represents sort of the wish of a majority of Ukrainian men to die on the front line. Yeah, reassured them to and then I must also say the Frau von der Leyen was extremely instrumental in grasping the opportunity of the war to try to restore a centralistic dynamic in the politics of the European Union that had long been sort of gone. Everybody was clear that that this sort of ever closer union of the European peoples and the centralization of government in Brussels rather than in the member states, that this was sort of gone, especially after the COVID crisis and the financial crisis. Financial crisis was solved by Merkel and Sarkozy, not by the European Union. It wasn't really solved. It was sort of put on the back burner. Yeah. Now then, she made commitments for Ukrainian membership in the European Union, membership of the West Balkans, membership of Georgia in the European Union. So that is the entire American strategy around the Black Sea, sort of became by stealth the strategy of the European Union. Now, if you know the internal life of this being, of this beast a little better, then the consequences for voting, funding, all of these things, the ability to take on credit, that all
Common
of this
agricultural policy.
yeah, absolutely. Who would command a European military strategy if it comes to that? The French president, because he sits on the Security Council and has nuclear arms, or the German chancellor, or Frau von der Leyen, some person in Brussels. It's totally unclear. What I want to say is that in these commitments made in the context of the Ukrainian war, the European Union has entered on a gamble more risky, or even as risky as the gamble of the French president when he calls these elections. It's sort of blindly walking into a tunnel without knowing where it ends. Yeah, and she was able to get this entire generation of European governments to always raise their hands when they met in Brussels and promised more and more and more support, even at the point when it became clear that after the elections in the United States this year, there would be much less support for Ukraine from the United States, if at all, because the United States will turn to another enemy who is located in the Chinese Sea. Yeah. So what is Europe going to do? And I would say the really dangerous thing in Europe is not the result of this election, and also not the composition of any group in this parliament. A parliament, incidentally, that cannot recall the government, that doesn't even elect the government, that has no legislative initiative, no right of legislative initiative. It rests with the commission. Yeah, a parliament that is not really a parliament. I think that the things that the council did in making these sort of very strange half-baked commitments to Ukraine to replace the United States if it came to this, that is the real how do you say combustion thing that is coming on the European Union, and that may be this next 5 years, and then the parliament is totally irrelevant. What is much more what will be relevant is the interplay between Germany and France in playing out these commitments.
Well, I wanted to ask about that because given, the degree of discontent with existing establishments, is going to make further expansion of the European Union significantly more difficult, whatever Brussels may have in theory committed itself to.
Yeah, it could be so, but under the pressure of war, and with all, and then with the question will be internally, what kind of commitment will Germany make in these contexts in order to bring in the others? Remember how fast Scholz changed from, so initially they sent 200 helmets to Ukraine. Now they are about to send the Patriots. And the Belgians are delivering the F-16s, although they are saying, I think in 4 years, the last F-16 will be there, which to me means that they are already beginning to assume that war is going to drag on for years. Yeah. And
Matthias, what do you think about the implications for further EU expansion?
I mean, you're right in a sense that the EU has made these commitments. I think it does feel that in the Western Balkans, it dropped the ball, right? That not admitting them or not accelerating or not engaging at least, or heavily investing in them, then opens up these places to, the influence of Russia and China. And I think they're equally worried about that in Moldova and Georgia and so on. But again, that's all the theory in Brussels, right? I mean, let's not forget enlargement is a very long process. This is going to be much more difficult than the Big Bang in 2004, and also with higher risk. And let's not forget, these things need to be ratified in every single member state. I mean, so
exactly.
Yeah, they can have a different process than previously and give some carrots along the way for the good performance. I can see carrots for Montenegro and things like that. But there's 10 countries. And remember, also at a time where they feel that Orban vetoes everything that they want to do they want to have 10 more vetoes? So they need internal reform. And then the last bit, of course, is money, budget. I mean, nobody wants to talk about that yet, but everybody becoming a net contributor so Ukraine can be admitted. I mean, the politics of that are toxic, right? And so at a time, as you mentioned, Anatol, of an anti-establishment mode, this seems like a very elite project indeed.
I would be surprised in future if you do not have German commentators adapting Bismarck's famous remark about the Balkans and saying something to the effect that the Balkans are not worth the healthy income of a single member of the German Mittelstand or agriculture. Yeah, I mean, it was already going to be complicated. It looks, even more complicated.
It looks absolutely. I think it looks absolutely messy, and it is sort of, in the longer run, one can think, well, one can withdraw from these things and so on. But the way to get there, it will sort of occupy the politics of the European Union. It will sort of raise hostilities. There will be all sorts of intermediate stages in which this will dominate the agenda, which will cause divisions internally in many of the member countries, and while the war is going on. Yeah, at this point, I can't even see the war being frozen in. It's like John Mearsheimer I think already a year ago in a very insightful article suggested that after everything that had been planned on the part of the West with respect to what to do with Russia, now the Russians sort of have become almost like the more successful war party. Shouldn't they think it in their interest now to slowly destroy Ukraine as a viable civil society, waiting for the oligarchs to go to Moscow, not to go to New York or London, for the population no longer willing to serve in the army, and the Russians just have no interest anymore in a ceasefire. That is a nightmare for the European Union. They would face defeat as a group of 27 countries unable to muster the capacity to really do what they always say: we want Ukraine to win. Yeah, how do you do this if you have a dispersed nuclear capacity facing the big nuclear capacity of the other side? I don't see how that can happen. Yeah. So I see years and years of desperate struggle on our side, what to do with this sort of open wound that will be bleeding for years.
Yes. So, Molly, what do you think on this? Is there any significant chance of the Europeans taking a new view of the Ukraine conflict?
Well, I'm not muted, am I? Okay, good. No, I was just going to say that, it is true that under von der Leyen, there's been a great deal of ambition in the European Commission and in Europe as a whole to play a geopolitical role and to enter into questions around defense industry development and things like that. And The thing is, though, when you really look at it, at least in my understanding, is that it's very unlikely that the national governments are going to relinquish that much authority or funding to the European Union, so that fundamentally any kind of rearmament that's meaningful in Western Europe or in Europe among the European Union member countries or NATO countries is going to have to be driven by national governments. And this brings me back to the fact that these kinds of developments in domestic policy, as reflected here in the elections, I think they really do have a an impact, in the sense that the engine of European the energy behind those sort of different steps of European deepening and broadening is all down to the Franco-German tandem. And what we're looking now at is a Germany in a very parlous situation, where it's 30% of the electorate alone is supporting its governing coalition. And I don't necessarily see any how that's going to change quickly, or who can replace the governing coalition and when. I guess the elections will be next year. But then with France going into what seems to be an incredibly dangerous or open-ended political crisis, I guess it's not easy to be optimistic about any either diplomatic or other kind of concerted action taking place that would make a difference on the trajectory of this war.
Several questions inevitably about immigration, because these results, and of course a whole succession of European election results over the years, do seem to show a clear, reaction against very heavy levels of migration in European populations. But equally, I mean, all the measures taken so far, including outside the European Union by the British government, have essentially failed significantly to change this trajectory. Do you expect to see in future much more radical measures? And could these also contribute to weakening the European Union, or it, because of actions by states on this, unilateral actions, would go clearly against core rules and institutions of the European Union? Matthias, how do you see this developing?
Yeah, I think a dangerous precedent here has been set by the Netherlands, right? So the Netherlands formed a coalition led by far-right Geert Wilders. And I think the kind of key ingredient of that government on immigration is basically all kinds of opt-outs from what the EU is doing, right? And coming originally from Belgium as I am, I was like, oh, great. So you're just going to leave them all at the Belgian border, and for that matter, at the German border. And that's going to make you a lot of friends in the EU, right? So, but it's clear that they have kind of doubled down on this sort of like almost British style opt-out, right, from the things in the EU that we don't like, right? In this case, it's not the euro, or to some extent it's something like Schengen, right? It's like we want to control our own sort of asylum seekers, immigrants, and we don't want to be part of any sort of EU solidarity scheme or anything like this. So that's one, I think, dangerous trend for EU cohesion that I can see happening in many other governments, because again, this is not Orban doing this. This is the Dutch doing this, right? An original member, supposedly very progressive people that are open to all kinds of, seafaring people, let's not forget, right? That are worldly and all that. So that's one element. The other element is when you look at Meloni, right? And I think to some extent also the British Tories, how they have governed immigration, they heavily focus on illegal immigrants who come in boats, right? Across the Channel, across the Mediterranean. We're cracking down on this. We're not going to let them board ships. We're going to make deals with countries. We're going to send them to Rwanda. We're going to keep them in Albania, whatever, right? But at the same time, legal immigration is going up dramatically, right? Which, as we've seen in the case of the UK, and even Meloni herself has admitted, like average age here is now close to 50, if not above. unlike China and the US, where average age is 39 and a half, right? We need people, right? But in the care sectors, in the hospitality sector, and all these things. And so we're basically going to, by stealth, very quietly do these things, right? And so that's where I think the current tension is on that debate.
Wolfgang, where do you see this going in Germany?
First of all, I would say I'm very much in agreement with Matthias that we're going to see more opt-outs in Europe, generally speaking, which is part of the fact, which comes with the fact that we now have 27 members. Don't forget we had 28 and one opted out really, yeah. And if you have such a heterogeneous collection of countries and such a big collection of countries, the idea that you can govern them sort of from the top, all in the same way, is totally unrealistic. There are different sort of political conditions or social conditions and so on in different countries, and they have to have a capacity to respond to these peculiarities of their own situation without being interfered with by sort of an authoritative bureaucracy in Brussels. Remember the COVID crisis, when von der Leyen insisted that there could be no border controls inside Europe. What happened? We had border controls all over the place because national governments, being urged by their population to protect them from death, whatever death there was, they acted responding to their people. Now, as far as Germany is concerned, we remember Denmark, which during the immigration crisis sort of closed their borders, and the only border Denmark has is with Germany. So they were there. Everybody else. I mean, the most migrants want to go to Germany. At the same time, Germany has a dear need to have people who can work in as Italy in elder care, the general healthcare system, but beyond this, and so one has to find a way of no longer making immigration something that a particular part of the population has to be afraid of. In what sense are they afraid? For example, my granddaughters go to school. They are children, young, 10, 12 years old. Yeah, these schools have a lot of children that can't speak German. Yeah, if you like us, sort of think that it is something that can be handled. If you're a teacher, or if you do not have that confidence, then you really feel that this is a problem for your family, for your children, for the same with healthcare, the same with housing. We have a housing crisis in Germany. We don't know where. We have now 1 million Ukrainian refugees in Germany. Yeah, where can they live? And so you have to handle the infrastructure problem first before you open up more doors for legal immigration. I see no other way. That, however, means that you have a lot of sort of collective expenses to, I mean, public money to invest in an infrastructure that is capable of receiving a lot of immigrants that are needed in this country in order to keep the country going. That is the puzzle that they have to solve. There is no constructive discussion of this problem. People sort of pretend that either the one side of the problem doesn't exist, infrastructure doesn't matter, we just let in whoever wants to come in, or on the other side, people who are denying that this country has to become a multicultural, if you want, multi-ethnic country in order to be able to keep going. Yeah, if you look at this new party, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, yeah, very interesting, most of the leading people in this group have immigration background. Yeah, and some of the most articulate members of this group will be willing to explain to you that they don't want others to have to go through the same misery that their families and they themselves went through before they were able to find a way into that society. They are not excited about repeating the errors of the former immigration policies.
And of course,
whether it will be possible to say something honest on this and then start some honest action to do something, I don't know, but that is what would be required.
And of course, at the same time, European states are saying or promising that they're going to radically increase their military spending.
Yeah.
Not easy to see how all of these things are compatible at the same time.
Yeah.
Questions on when it comes to expansion, are we perhaps going to have to look at, Macron hinted at this in the form of, his idea of European political community, that people will eventually have to move to a much tighter core European Union and a looser outer one, precisely because it won't be possible, in fact, to bring in new states. Matthias, what do you think on that? Is that a likely way forward?
Yeah, I'm aware of time. Can I actually pass this on to Molly? I'd like to hear what she thinks. Molly?
Actually, am I okay? I think there's a very strong disposition against doing that in the European Union, against a two-speed or a core and an outer. I think the Ukrainians and other countries that want to accede would be very unhappy with that as well. And so I think what's going to have to happen is there would need to be a root and branch reform of programmatically the support for agriculture and other sorts of programs like that result in like Matthias indicated, there's going to be a large number of countries that have been net recipients of EU funding for the time since they acceded are going to find themselves being net contributors. And that'll make the whole accession very hard to stomach politically. So I think the only thing to be done would take a lot of courage and a lot of ingenuity is to come up with a way to reform these structures so that there would be not such a generous support for Ukraine, but not for anybody else either. In other words, equalize it across the board.
Anatol, one thing I would add to what Molly said is that, I mean, when it comes to the organization of a European defense, this doesn't have to be done by the European Union, right? I mean, it's very clear, and that's, I think, which is an interesting development by Labour likely coming to power on July 4 in the UK, that David Lammy and Labour have already offered this basically implicit deal to the European Union saying, listen, we will make a defense pact with you. We will, help lead the European defense effort, basically in return for, let's be honest, easier single market access or something, right? I mean, they're going to want something. That's, of course, going to be tricky if Brussels is still in the same spirit that they were the way they negotiated the Brexit deal. Of course, that was pre-Ukraine, was pre-pandemic. Actually, it was during pandemic, but pre-Ukraine. So if you have a situation where Donald Trump comes back to the White House, for that matter, even if Biden is in the White House, that threat of an America that's going to withdraw from Europe is not going away, right? So, I mean, at some point, the Europeans will have to wake up. And if you organize defense and foreign and security policy with the EU playing a role, but not the EU organizing it for the EU, right? So basically doing procurement, or maybe, you know, coming up with money or a joint fund or whatever, making the single market rules more flexible for defense. I mean, this is all very hard stuff, because I mean, you have to get out of a kind of paradigm from the 90s and the 2000s that they still quite haven't left. But there you could see other European countries that aren't quite members of the EU yet joining, and then the EU would then focus more on things like single market and the euro and making that work. But Molly's absolutely right. I mean, the candidate countries don't want it. And I think many, especially the countries in the East, including Poland, the Baltics, don't want it either, right? They want to be in the middle of a bigger European Union rather than at the edge. And so in many ways, I mean, these are very hard questions going forward.
I mean, just two very short remarks. I mean, wars are about killing and getting killed. And in a political community, you want your own government to represent you on these questions, so to speak. Yeah. It is impossible, ultimately impossible, to sort of bring in the United Kingdom to decide who's going to die on the continent. And the problem with Europe and its nation states is that it is very hard to conceive a sort of a common strategic center. In Washington, this is the United States, one continent, one big country. In Europe, it's one continent and 15, 17, 27 countries. And who wants to die for whom? The German security policy problem was always either protected by France or by the United States. When it came to the Gaullists in the German foreign policy establishment, they were always asked, do you really think that the French will sacrifice Paris for Berlin? And of course, the answer is no. Yeah, that makes it very. And then the other thing, Molly mentioned that reform. The problem with the European Union is that its constitution basically doesn't exist. It consists of two unbelievably complex treaties that can be changed only unanimously by all 27 member states, plus the European Court of Justice, not the Parliament. The Parliament doesn't decide much, but the European Court of Justice is the source of the permanent updating of our constitution, by sort of adding to the treaties and interpreting them. Can you imagine an assembly of 27 states that would be willing to open up these treaties and replace them with a less centralistic image? I was very much interested in what Matthias said on the need to find a more decentralized sort of constitution of this unit. It will be the question whether the small ones will allow the big ones to go on their own, because the small ones can hope to be more numerous and thereby to tell, especially the Germans, what to do and for whom. It is an absolute mess. And the idea of an irreversible constitution, which is exactly what the neoliberal turn of the 1990s sort of imposed on the European Union, an irreversible constitution, because we now know how this sort of thing, capitalist economy plus a state system, can be governed. And now we're stuck with a sort of huge amount of rules that do no longer fit what is going on now, and we do not have the capacity to revise them so that they do fit what is demanded.
And certainly, I think there's a chance of more and more states simply rejecting judgments by the European Court of Justice. I mean, that played a big part in the whole Brexit debate in Britain.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, I mean, the further future looks, well, very unclear. and which gives us a lot to discuss in future, which of course we're all very good at. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I apologize to people in the audience whose questions I couldn't manage to pass on. But thank you all so much. I hope I will see some members of the audience at the book talk on Thursday with Ian Proud. And my thanks to all the participants for a really interesting discussion on some key issues, which I think here in Washington are often not nearly well enough understood when it comes to Europe. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon, I hope.